Hey guys, tonight we begin with a simple question from the ancient world. What happened to Roman soldiers who refused to fight? Before we start, take a moment to relax, dim the lights a little, put your phone on night mode, maybe sit back or lie down comfortably. Tonight we are traveling slowly into the dusty world of ancient Rome, a world of marching armies, strict discipline, and soldiers who were expected to obey every order without hesitation. The Roman army was one of the most powerful military forces in history. For hundreds of years, it conquered lands across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Roman legions marched through forests, deserts, mountains, and unfamiliar cities. They built roads, forts, and entire military camps as they moved across the empire. But even though the Roman army looked powerful and organized, the soldiers themselves were still human beings. They felt fear, they felt exhaustion, they missed home, and sometimes when they stood on a battlefield and looked at the enemy waiting in front of them, some soldiers simply did not want to fight. For the Roman army, that hesitation was a serious problem. The Roman military system depended on discipline more than anything else. A Roman legion could contain around 5,000 soldiers. These men had to move together like a single machine. They trained constantly so that every soldier knew exactly where to stand and what to do. In battle, they formed tight shield walls and pushed forward slowly as a unit. If one soldier broke formation, the entire line could weaken, and if the line weakened, the enemy could break through. Because of this, Roman commanders believed discipline was the key to survival. This meant that refusing to fight was considered a major crime. In some cases, the punishment was immediate execution. Roman commanders had the authority to punish soldiers directly on the battlefield. If a soldier openly refused an order during combat, the commander could order that soldier to be killed in front of the other troops. This harsh punishment was meant to send a clear message. Every soldier needed to understand that fear could not be allowed to control the army. However, execution was not the only punishment used by the Romans. The Roman military system had several different ways to deal with cowardice or disobedience. One of the most famous punishments in Roman history was called decimation. The word decimation comes from the Latin word for 10. It literally means removing 1 out of every 10 soldiers. This punishment was usually used when an entire unit failed in battle or showed cowardice as a group. When decimation was ordered, the soldiers of the unit were divided into groups of 10 men. Each group then drew lots to determine who would be punished. One soldier was chosen by chance. The remaining 9 soldiers were then required to execute him. Most often, they used clubs or stones. The purpose of this brutal punishment was to terrify the rest of the army and restore discipline. If soldiers knew that cowardice could lead to this kind of punishment, they were far less likely to run away from battle. Although decimation is often mentioned in history books, it was actually used very rarely. Roman commanders understood that losing 10% of their soldiers was not a good military strategy. An army that kills its own men too often will eventually run out of soldiers. Because of this, decimation was usually reserved for very serious situations when a commander believed discipline had completely collapsed.
One well-known example of decimation occurred during the war against the rebel army of Spartacus. The rebellion was led by a former gladiator named Spartacus, who escaped from slavery and gathered thousands of followers. The rebellion became one of the most dangerous threats the Roman Republic had ever faced. During this conflict, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus was given command of the Roman forces. At one point, several Roman units panicked and retreated from the rebels. Crassus believed this cowardice could destroy the entire campaign. In response, he ordered the punishment of decimation for the units that had fled. The result was immediate and terrifying discipline throughout the army. Most soldiers who refused to fight, however, faced punishments that were less dramatic, but still very unpleasant. One common punishment was public humiliation. Roman culture placed a strong value on honor and reputation. A brave soldier could earn awards, promotions, and the respect of his fellow soldiers, but a coward could lose all of that respect instantly. Commanders sometimes forced cowardly soldiers to stand in front of the entire legion while their actions were described. Losing the respect of thousands of fellow soldiers was often worse than physical punishment. Another common punishment involved removing a soldier's weapons and assigning him to hard labor. Instead of fighting in the battle line, the soldier might be ordered to dig trenches, carry heavy supplies, or build fortifications for the army. These jobs were physically exhausting and offered none of the glory that soldiers hoped to achieve in battle. More importantly, the rest of the legion would see that the soldier had lost his place among them. The Romans also used small humiliations to punish cowardly behavior. For example, a soldier might be forced to eat barley instead of wheat. This might sound like a minor punishment, but Roman soldiers considered barley to be food for animals. Wheat bread was the normal food for soldiers, while barley was associated with horses and livestock. Being forced to eat barley was a symbolic way of saying that the soldier had behaved like an animal rather than a disciplined Roman warrior. Sometimes commanders used another method that was both simple and dangerous. A soldier who showed fear might be placed in the most dangerous position during the next battle. This usually meant standing in the front line where the fighting was the most intense. Roman commanders believed this could give the soldier a chance to prove his bravery and regain his honor. Of course, it also meant the soldier had a much higher chance of being injured or killed. Entire units could also suffer punishment if they performed poorly in battle. A legion that showed cowardice could lose its honors and military decorations. The banners and symbols of the legion might be taken away. In some cases, the soldiers could even be dismissed from service entirely. This meant they would return home without rewards, land, or honor. In Roman society, that kind of failure could follow a man for the rest of his life. It is important to remember that Roman soldiers were not fearless heroes. Most of them were ordinary people. Many came from farming families. Some were very young when they joined the army. Others spent 20 years or more serving far from home. They marched long distances, carried heavy equipment, and lived in rough camps for most of their lives. Fear during battle was a natural human reaction. Ancient battles were also incredibly chaotic. Soldiers fought at very close distances with swords and spears. Shields crashed together. Men shouted orders and battle cries. Dust and noise filled the air. In those moments, confusion and panic could spread quickly through the ranks. A single soldier running away might cause several others to follow. Before long, the entire formation could collapse. Because of this constant danger, Roman commanders believed strict discipline was the only way to maintain control. Harsh punishments were meant to prevent panic before it started. The fear of punishment was supposed to be stronger than the fear of the enemy. And for many centuries, this system worked. The Roman army remained one of the most effective fighting forces in the ancient world. Its discipline allowed it to defeat enemies that were often larger in number. But the story does not end there. Sometimes the soldiers themselves became the greatest challenge for Roman leaders. There were moments in Roman history when entire legions refused to obey orders. Instead of fighting the enemy, they protested against their own commanders. They demanded better pay, shorter service, and fair treatment. These moments were known as mutinies, and when thousands of trained soldiers decided they were no longer willing to fight, the Roman government suddenly had a very serious problem.
In the next part, we will explore these mutinies and see what happened when Roman soldiers collectively refused to fight. Sometimes the results were violent. Sometimes the results changed Roman history in surprising ways. For now, imagine the quiet Roman camp at night. Fires are burning slowly. Soldiers sit together after a long day of marching. Some sharpen their weapons, others talk quietly about home, and somewhere in the camp a nervous commander hopes that when the next battle comes, every soldier will stand his ground. After the dust settled and the soldiers slept, sometimes the real trouble began. Individual cowardice was one problem. Whole legions refusing orders was another. These were called mutinies, and the Romans hated mutinies more than almost anything else. A single soldier could be punished and replaced. A mutiny meant thousands of soldiers could not be trusted. That was very dangerous. Mutinies usually happened for practical reasons. Soldiers were tired, pay was late, food was bad, service was long. Sometimes soldiers were asked to fight in wars far from home, in deserts or mountains, without proper supplies. Rome expected obedience, but human patience has limits, and when those limits were reached, entire units would refuse to fight. One famous example occurred during the late Roman Republic. Soldiers were marching across Europe. The campaigns were long and exhausting. Supplies were scarce. Tensions rose. The soldiers began to complain. At first it was grumbling. Then it became open refusal. The commander could not simply threaten them with decimation or execution. The entire unit would fight back against orders if pressured, and in some cases they did. Roman commanders responded in a few ways. Sometimes they negotiated. They promised pay or rewards. Sometimes they threatened harsh punishments. Occasionally they combined the two. A clever commander could calm a mutiny without bloodshed, but these situations were tense. Soldiers knew they had leverage. Commanders knew failure could mean disaster. It was a delicate balance. Interestingly, mutinies were not always about cowardice. Soldiers were often brave but frustrated. They had endured years of harsh conditions. They had seen comrades die from disease, starvation, or battle. They had worked long marches in mud, heat, and cold. Mutiny was sometimes the only way to be heard. It was a kind of protest, not honorable but understandable. Roman writers often described mutinies with a mixture of horror and admiration. They disliked the chaos, but they sometimes respected the courage it took for soldiers to challenge authority. After all, the Roman army demanded obedience above all else. To oppose it was risky. The soldiers knew this, and yet they still did. Punishments for mutiny could be extreme. Entire units could be stripped of their banners. Officers might be executed. Soldiers could be dispersed, sent to dangerous posts, or even forced to fight suicidal battles. But commanders also learned that compromise sometimes worked better. A hungry, tired, and angry soldier would fight better if fed, paid, and treated with minimal respect. There are several recorded mutinies where soldiers marched on their commanders' camps. They carried weapons, but not always with the intention to kill. Sometimes they simply demanded better conditions. Their presence alone was terrifying. A trained legion confronting a general was a serious risk. Roman generals had to be careful. Misjudging the soldiers could result in mass chaos. Some emperors faced mutinies with unusual strategies. Julius Caesar, for example, occasionally rewarded soldiers with extra pay or privileges. Other times he threatened harsh punishment. It was a careful mixture of carrot and stick. Caesar knew that fear alone could backfire. Too much cruelty could spark more disobedience, but too much leniency could weaken authority. Managing soldiers was a constant balancing act. Mutinies also reveal the human side of Roman soldiers. They were not just instruments of war. They were people with feelings, families, and limits. They experienced fatigue, fear, and frustration. They had moments when the word no seemed like the only reasonable answer, and sometimes Rome had to respect that answer, at least partially. Even so, refusing to fight had lasting consequences. Soldiers involved in mutinies could lose promotions, their reputations could be damaged, their units could be dissolved or reassigned, and Rome never forgot. Military law was strict. Disobedience left marks. A soldier who refused to fight risked years of hardship, even if he survived physically.
Interestingly, Roman society both feared and depended on these soldiers. Rome's power rested on disciplined armies, yet the armies were made of ordinary humans, and humans have limits. The tension between discipline and humanity shaped much of Roman military history. It explains why punishments were severe, but also why negotiations existed. Rome could not function without its soldiers, and soldiers were not machines. Another factor was fear of shame. Roman culture prized honor above life in some ways. A soldier who refused to fight often suffered public disgrace. This shame could linger for life. It affected his family, career, and social standing. Sometimes shame was considered worse than death. Execution removed the problem physically. Disgrace removed it socially. Both were tools to enforce obedience. Food and sleep were also used as punishment. Soldiers who refused orders might receive inferior rations. They might sleep outside the camp walls. They might carry heavy burdens. These punishments were less dramatic than decimation, but still effective. They reminded soldiers that failure had consequences, and that obedience was valued above comfort or personal feelings. Despite all of this, some soldiers did survive refusal. Occasionally, they were given another chance. Sometimes commanders were pragmatic. A soldier who made a mistake could be forgiven if his skills were needed. But this depended entirely on the commander's judgment. Rome did not have a standard policy for every situation. Discipline was always context-dependent. The lessons from these stories are quiet but clear. Roman soldiers could refuse to fight. The consequences were severe. They could face death, shame, or labor. They could lose their place in the legion. Sometimes entire units could protest and negotiate. The army depended on obedience, but human limits always existed. Fear, fatigue, and frustration were constants. Discipline was harsh, but flexible when necessary. As we slowly imagine the Roman camp at night, we see soldiers resting after a long day. Fires burn low. Some men sharpen weapons quietly. Others talk softly about home. Some dream of fields, wives, and children far away. The commanders sit in tents, planning the next march or battle, and somewhere the fear of disobedience lingers in the air. It is a quiet, constant tension, a reminder that even the greatest army depended on human will. Tonight we leave the Roman soldiers in their camp. They rest, they dream, and they prepare. Some may refuse orders tomorrow. Some may run. Some may obey without question. And Rome will continue, harsh, disciplined, and human. Tomorrow we will return and see more of what it meant to serve, survive, and sometimes fail in the Roman army. Not every story about refusing to fight involves large groups or mutinies. Sometimes it was a single soldier who paused, hesitated, or turned away from the front line. And even one person's choice could have consequences. Roman commanders noticed everything. The army depended on trust, and trust was fragile. A single soldier's hesitation could ripple through the ranks. Sometimes it did, and sometimes it did not. But the consequences were always serious. Roman soldiers were trained from the moment they joined. They learned marching drills, weapon handling, and battle formations. They practiced for hours every day. But training could only prepare a soldier so much. Fear was natural. Even the most disciplined legionary could feel panic. And sometimes, in the chaos of battle, a soldier froze, or slipped behind the line, or ran. And when that happened, commanders reacted quickly. Punishments for individual refusal varied. Some soldiers were executed immediately. Others were given harsh labor. Often the punishment involved humiliation. Roman commanders understood that morale and fear were intertwined.
Public shame could be as effective as physical punishment. Soldiers who saw a comrade embarrassed or beaten were less likely to act similarly themselves. Obedience became a mixture of fear and respect. One example comes from accounts of campaigns in Germania. Roman soldiers marched through forests, swamps, and rivers. The enemy was skilled in ambushes. Units became tired and thirsty. Some soldiers began to question the leadership. When a few men refused to fight in a skirmish, the officers responded firmly. The men were forced to stand in the mud while their actions were explained to the entire legion. Some were assigned the most dangerous positions in the next battle. Others were forced to carry heavy supplies under the hot sun. The punishments were designed to restore order slowly without completely destroying the unit. Sometimes hesitation could be forgiven, but not easily. A soldier who made a mistake might be given another chance if he was skilled or useful. But if the hesitation was repeated, or if it endangered comrades, there was little mercy. Discipline in the Roman army was not just a guideline, it was a law of survival. Soldiers learned that obedience often mattered more than bravery or even common sense, and yet human limits always persisted. Fear also affected commanders. They could not act impulsively. Executing a soldier might restore discipline immediately, but it could also create resentment. Soldiers might whisper complaints or quietly refuse other orders. A clever commander often weighed the consequences before punishing. Sometimes a quiet warning was enough. Other times public punishment was necessary. Managing fear was as important as fighting the enemy.
The army also relied on rituals and symbols to reinforce obedience. Soldiers carried banners, wore armor in standard formations, and marched in unison. Any break in this order could signal weakness. Commanders used this to their advantage. They reminded soldiers constantly that discipline was part of honor. Obedience was tied to identity. Running away was not just a personal failure, it was a social failure. Shame was always near. Interestingly, Roman sources note that some soldiers resisted orders for reasons that were not cowardice. A soldier might refuse because he disagreed with a strategy, or because the enemy's position was dangerous, or because the soldier had lost faith in his commander. These refusals were rare, but they happened, and they could force Roman leaders to reconsider their approach. Discipline was harsh, but not blind. Successful commanders understood that listening, even in a small way, could strengthen the army in the long run. The consequences of refusal were not just immediate. Soldiers carried the memory of punishment for the rest of their lives. A man beaten for hesitation might remember the faces of those who executed the punishment. He might feel shame in front of comrades forever. And in Roman society, this reputation could affect family and career. Some soldiers lived quietly, avoiding attention for years after a mistake. Others tried to regain honor through extraordinary bravery. Both paths were difficult and uncertain. Even with the threat of punishment, hesitation persisted. Fear was human. Fatigue was human. Hunger and homesickness were human. Soldiers had been taken far from their families, forced to march long distances, and asked to perform impossible tasks. Sometimes they simply could not obey, and the army had to respond. It was a constant balance between fear, discipline, and understanding. Too much cruelty could destroy morale. Too little could lead to chaos. In addition to punishment, commanders developed other ways to encourage obedience. Rewards for bravery, extra pay, and privileges could motivate soldiers. Promotions and decorations reminded soldiers that courage had tangible benefits. Legionaries who followed orders reliably received praise and recognition. Soldiers watched these examples carefully. Sometimes, seeing a comrade rewarded was more effective than seeing another punished. The Romans understood that motivation was as much about honor as it was about fear. The stories of hesitation, punishment, and obedience remind us that the Roman army was not a machine.
It was a network of human beings. Each soldier had strengths and weaknesses. Each unit faced challenges unique to the time and place. The army's power came from discipline, yes, but also from adaptation. Commanders learned from each instance of refusal, from every mutiny, and from every hesitant soldier. And the soldiers learned the price of disobedience, often painfully. As night falls again in the Roman camp, we can imagine the soldiers quietly thinking about the day's events. Some recall mistakes and punishments. Some think of comrades lost in battle. Some dream of home, of fields, of families left behind. And somewhere, a commander plans the next march. He hopes that tomorrow every soldier will stand firm. But deep down, he knows that fear will never completely disappear, and that hesitation, however rare, is a part of being human.